Yes, welcome back, friends. The last unit or the last topic under Sale of Goods Act 1930. We just happened to cover the rights of an unpaid seller in the previous session. There are three rights as far as the rights of unpaid seller is concerned with respect to goods. One was right of lien, second was right of stoppage in transit, and the third one was right of resale. Although we have covered right of lien and right of stoppage, or rather right of resale in my previous video, it becomes pertinent and very important to understand the second right as far as the goods is concerned to the unpaid seller, that is right of stoppage in transit, short form RST. Pretty important as far as exams is concerned. This independently can come as a question. Now, what do you mean by a right of stoppage in transit? Stoppage in transit, that means the goods are already in movement. It is on with the carrier, or it is under the course of or in due course of transportation, and the unpaid seller stops it. So we are looking at a scenario which is after right of lien but before right of resale. Very interesting. Let's see what it is. First and foremost of all, the conditions for right of stoppage in transit to be exercised is the buyer should be insolvent. If and only if the buyer is insolvent, this topic or this right works. Else, right of stoppage in transit has no meaning whatsoever. What do you mean by this? Let's see. The unpaid seller has delivered the goods to the carrier or the bailey. For the purpose of what? It is for the purpose of transportation. That is, the unpaid seller may resume back the possession as long as goods are in transmission. What do you mean by this? It means the right of lien is lost. That means the possession of goods is not anymore with the unpaid seller. He has shifted the goods to the carrier or the bailey for the purpose of transportation or for the purpose of reaching it to the buyer. Now the situation is like this, where there is a contract of sale, goods is yet to be delivered, buyer is yet to pay the price, a right of lien is lost. That means no more the seller is having the possession of the goods. He loads the goods to the lorry. Just as an example I'm telling. It could be a railway, it could be ship also. So the carrier here is the lorry guy, wherein the seller has loaded the goods to the lorry and the lorry is in movement and yet to reach the buyer's place. Now assume the seller asks the buyer to pay the money. If the buyer refuses or rejects to pay the money, then we are seeing a mechanism wherein the seller can inform the carrier to return back the goods, to get back the possession and custody of the goods, to retain his safety. Let's see what it means. So the first 3 points are very critical. Buyer should be insolvent. The unpaid seller has delivered the goods to the carrier for the purpose of transportation. If the right of stoppage in transit has to work, the seller informs the carrier to return back the goods. That is, unpaid seller may resume back possession as long as goods are in transmission. Very critical to understand up to what point of time is goods are in transmission. Therefore, we go on to understand point by point what is the duration of transit. For how long can we say that the goods were in transit? Up to what point of time can we say the goods were in transmission or goods were in movement? Let us see one by one. First point, deemed to be in transit when delivered to the carrier or bailey until, observe this point, until the buyer or his agent who acts on behalf of him takes the delivery from such carrier or the bailey. So, when the seller has loaded the goods to the lorry is in movement. Up to what point of time can we say that the goods are in transit? Up to a point of time where the buyer or the agent who works on behalf of him takes the delivery from such carrier or bailee. So till the point of time where the buyer or his agent takes the delivery from the carrier or the bailee, we can say that the goods are in movement or the goods are in transmission. Fantastic. Let's see the next point then. If by chance the buyer or his agent takes delivery of the goods before the arrival at the appointed destination, then also the transit ends. Means what? Let's say the goods have been moved in a train from Mumbai to Bangalore and clearly instructed that the appointed destination is, let's say, Cantonment railway station. That is, the goods can be delivered to the buyer by the carrier at a point of destination called Cantonment railway station. But if by chance one stage or one station before, let's say there is Yeshwantpur railway station, and if the buyer or his agent were successful to take the delivery from the carrier or the bailee in Yeshwantpur railway station, it is deemed to have been completed, in a sense that the transit has ended, the delivery of the goods has reached the buyer, no doubt about it. Even if it has reached his agent, it is amounting to goods delivered to the buyer. Now, when I say successfully takes it in the previous destination or any destination before the appointed destination, I mean to say not forcefully, but in the natural course of action, he's taken the delivery. It cannot be by unlawful means. You can imagine a situation wherein, let's say the goods have come to Yeshwantpur railway station, that is one station before Cantonment railway station. The buyer or his agent were waiting there, and let's say this carrier, who was also coincidentally on the platform, reaches out to the buyer for whatever specified dramatical reasons, and eventually if buyer and or his agent convinces the carrier that he is the buyer with all his proofs and takes delivery in Yeshwantpur railway station, the transit ends there itself. It is not that the transit is still in course up to Cantonment railway station. I hope you are getting my point. Let's see further how interesting it can become. If in case at the appointed destination the carrier or bailee acknowledges to the buyer or his agent that he holds the goods on behalf of them, then also the transit ends. That means, what are we looking at? Let's say the appointed destination, taking the example from my previous case, is Cantonment railway station. The buyer or his appointed agent reaches out to the carrier or the bailee and eventually takes the delivery from the carrier or bailee, in a sense that if the carrier or the bailee acknowledges the fact, agrees to the fact that henceforth he will hold these goods on behalf of the buyer, then transit ends there. I hope you are getting my point. If the carrier, that is the railway guy, says, yes, I have brought the goods from Mumbai to Bangalore to be delivered to you or to your agent, I am convinced that you are the person called buyer or you are the agent of such and such buyer, henceforth I will take care of the goods, it will be there in the godown. If he acknowledges the fact that he is brought the goods only for them and he henceforth holds the goods on behalf of them, then transit ends at that point of time. I hope you are getting my point. Next, further, it is irrelevant if further destination of goods have been indicated by the buyer. That means irrelevant if the destination of the goods has been indicated by the buyer means, let's assume that the Cantonment railway station is the point of final destination and the carrier has acknowledged the fact that henceforth the goods will be held by the carrier on behalf of the buyer. It is irrelevant if the buyer says to the carrier that kindly deliver the goods to the next station, that is, let's say, East Station of Bangalore. So the moment acknowledgement of fact has happened, henceforth the goods is held by the railway guide on behalf of the buyer. It is irrelevant if the buyer instructs the carrier to carry the goods further to the other station. We cannot say that the goods is still in transmission. The transit has already ended in the destination which was appointed, where the buyer or his agent were present, and the carrier or the bailee has acknowledged the fact that henceforth he will be holding the goods on behalf of the buyer. So the transit has ended there itself. It is irrelevant if the buyer requests for further transportation of the goods. Even if he requests for further transportation of the goods, we cannot say that the goods is in transit. I hope you are understanding it. Next, if the goods are rejected by the buyer and the carrier or the bailee continues possession, transit is deemed not to have ended even if the seller refuses to receive them back. Very interesting. I read this again for you. If the goods are rejected by the buyer, let's say at the appointed destination, the goods have been rejected by the buyer, he is not taking the delivery, and the carrier or the bailee continues to be in possession of the goods, then transit is said to have been deemed to be in existence. It will continue to be in possession of the carrier or the bailee who is representing the seller. Therefore, we can say that the transit has not ended. The right of stoppage in transit still exists. Reason: the rejection of the buyer effectively means the possession is still with the carrier or the bailee who represents the seller. So therefore we can say that the goods is still in transit, and right of stoppage in transit can be exercised even at that point of time. Note, very important, see this, even if seller refuses to receive them back. Oh, fantastic. So buyer has rejected the goods, the carrier is still holding the possession of the goods on behalf of the seller. Seller at one end is saying, no, I do not want to take back the goods. Now whose goods is it? Is it the buyer's goods or the seller's goods? Definitely it is still the seller's goods, because the carrier is holding the possession of the goods on behalf of the seller, irrespective of the fact whether the seller has rejected to take them back or not. One end the buyer is not accepting, or rather the buyer is rejecting the goods. The other end the seller is not accepting back the goods, even he is rejecting the goods. Can we say who is the person to be blamed here? Yes, we can say that since the carrier or the bailee is holding the possession of the goods and still the goods are in transit, right of stoppage in transit still exists to the seller. Therefore the goods belongs to the seller. I hope you got my point in this clear explanation. Next we go on to the next point, that is sixth point. If the goods are delivered to a ship which is chartered by the buyer, chartered means he owns the ship or probably he has hired the ship, then we have to check another critical point here. What is that? If the goods are delivered to a ship chartered by the buyer, check if the master of the ship is holding the goods as an agent or bailee on behalf of the buyer. Just the fact that the ship belongs to the buyer, or just the fact that the ship is hired by the buyer, should I say just the fact that the ship is chartered by the buyer, does not mean that as soon as the goods is loaded to the ship, it belongs to the buyer or delivery is taken place to the buyer. We have to check another important fact, that the master of the ship, whether he's taken the delivery of the goods as an agent who works on behalf of the buyer, or as a bailee to keep the safe custody of the goods on behalf of the buyer. Only if this fact is established, we can say delivery is completed and the goods is no more under transition. Please observe the important fact. The seller has loaded the goods to the ship at the port of the seller. The ship is yet to be transported, or it is yet to be under the movement. Just because the fact that the ship belongs to the buyer doesn't mean that the transit has ended. We have to check another fact, that is whether the master of the ship is holding these goods on behalf of the buyer or as a bailee of the buyer, in a sense that whether he's holding it as an agent or the bailee of the buyer. Only then we can say the delivery is being completed to the buyer even though the ship has not moved an inch. So kindly observe that interesting point where the ship is chartered by the buyer. We have to further check whether the master of the ship who is taking the delivery of the goods or who is having the possession of the goods is in fact having the possession of the goods as an agent or the bailee of the buyer. If and only if that is proved, we can say transit has ended. And just because the ship is chartered by the buyer, we cannot say that delivery to the chartered ship which belongs to the buyer is effectively delivery. Therefore, we can still argue on those points and defend the case wherein in case the master of the ship is not holding the goods on behalf of the buyer as an agent or the bailee, then ship continues or the goods continues to be in transit till it reaches the buyer. I hope you got the interesting twist in that point. Let's see further what it is. 7th point. In case the carrier or the bailee wrongfully refuses to deliver the goods to the buyer or his agent, then transit is deemed to have been ended. Let's take a scenario about the cantonment railway station example. The buyer or his agent is present at the location which is appointed destination. The seller has also reached the appointed destination, or rather the carrier has also reached the appointed destination. The buyer is pleading before the carrier that he is the rightful owner, and for known reasons or unknown reasons, if the carrier has refused to deliver the goods, or if the carrier is expecting some money out of such a transaction just to help the delivery of goods, and refused eventually to deliver the goods to the buyer, then we should still say that the transit has ended, regardless of the fact that the possession was still with the carrier. Understand this? I would like to repeat this point again. The goods has reached the cantonment railway station, which is the appointed destination. Buyer or his agent was present there. The carrier was also present. Buyer pleads that he is the owner of the goods and wants to take delivery of the goods. The carrier, for whatever reasons, good or bad, or for whatever reasons, denies this refusal or refuses to deliver the goods to the buyer or his agent, then we can conclude the fact just that the delivery has been completed because of the simple fact that buyer has done whatever was needful to establish the fact that he is the owner of the goods, and for known or unknown reasons, if the carrier has refused to deliver the goods, then, mind you, transit has ended. Sir, what if the carrier of the goods has not delivered or refused to deliver the goods to the buyer because of the word instructed by the seller? Then we go back to the previous point where seller has reserved the right of disposal. When the seller has reserved the right of disposal, it is fair enough for the carrier to tell, only upon payment I shall deliver. If there is no payment, the carrier need not deliver to the buyer or his agent. Then we cannot say the carrier has wrongfully refused. I hope you got the missing link over there. Let's continue further on this discussion. Next, where part delivery is given, the remaining can be stopped. Let's say there are 100 lots, 60 lots have been delivered, the remaining 40 lots can be stopped, but we have to check the contract for it. Check this, where part delivery is given, the remaining can be stopped, but contract should not mention part delivery as whole delivery. If the contract has mentioned part delivery as though it is a whole delivery, then even if part delivery is made, the whole delivery of 100 lots have to be made. In a sense, let's assume dramatically that 60 units have been delivered from the railway bogies to the buyer or his agent, and 40 are still in the railway bogies. Can we say that 40 which is in the railway bogies are still in transit. That depends on the fact of the matter whether the contract provides for the same or not. By chance, if the contract has stated part delivery as though is old delivery, part delivery should be treated as old delivery, which we have seen in the delivery chapter, then 60 units which is already, or 60 lots which is already delivered to the buyer or his agent, 40 which is still in the bogies, that 40 is also deemed to have been delivered, because part delivery is nothing but full delivery as far as the contract is concerned. Mind you, the other possibility is also there, wherein if by chance the contract states part delivery does not amount to full delivery, then only 60 units or 60 lots is actually delivered. The 40 lots which is still in bogie is deemed to be in transit. Then the right of stoppage in transit applies to the extent of 40 lots, because the contract has specifically stated that, if the contract has specifically stated that part delivery does not amount to full delivery. I hope you got that example as well. Next, right of stoppage in transit can be exercised by taking back actual possession or by giving notice to the carrier or the bailee. Now, what is all this all about? Why are we reading all these things? At what point of time does the transit end? Up to whatever point of time the transit ends, which we have seen in the various points above, till that point of time, the seller can actually take back the physical possession of the goods by exercising the right of stoppage in transit, or he can give notice to the carrier or the bailee not to deliver the goods to the buyer or his agent, effectively amounting to establishment of the fact that the right of stoppage in transit is exercised. I hope you have understood what I said. That means right of stoppage in transit can be exercised by physically taking the actual possession of the goods, or by giving a notice to the carrier. If the seller has informed the carrier, or if the seller has informed the bailee not to deliver the goods by way of a notice, then the carrier or the bailee cannot deliver the goods to the buyer. That is the meaning of right of stoppage in transit, by exercising it. Next, when notice is given, the carrier or the bailee shall re-deliver the goods to the seller, or according to the instructions of the seller. So, maybe the price is not yet paid by the buyer. Seller has informed by way of a notice to the carrier or the bailee not to deliver the goods. So, what does the carrier or the bailee do? He re-delivers back to the seller. As simple as that. He re-delivers back the goods to the seller, or uses the goods according to the instructions of the seller. Maybe the seller has instructed that at another point of destination there is another buyer waiting for him. The right of resale can be exercised by the seller. Therefore, this goods which is in the railway bogie can further be transported or transmitted or transited, should I say, to the next port or the next point of destination, and make a resell to them. The fact that from this point of destination to the next point of destination, if the goods are in transit, you cannot say that the buyer can still take the delivery in the next transit. The new buyer can take it, because right of stoppage in transit has already been exercised by the seller. Coupled with that, he is also exercising the right of resell. I hope it was convincing enough for you to understand the point number 10. Point number 11 is pretty simple. The expenses of redelivering should be borne by the seller only. The expenses of redelivering, it is quite logical, it should be borne by the seller only. Sir, can he recover back this from the buyer later? Yes, he can file a suit for damages, and he can file a suit for price, and thereby, which is, this particular non-payment has caused a loss to the seller. That loss can be definitely recovered by the seller from the buyer in a suit for recovery of price and damages. Let's see further what happens if there is a sub-sale or a pledge of goods. Now, before taking the actual delivery by the buyer or his agent, if the buyer or his agent has made a sub-sale, or if he is pledged this such goods, sir, can he do it? Yes, because he's still the owner of the goods. Remember, possession only is with the seller. He is acting on behalf of the buyer who is holding the possession of the goods, agreed, but he is waiting for the price. Now, if the buyer or his agent has made a sub-sale or he has pledged such goods to another party, then this right of stoppage in transit cannot get affected. Please check what I have written. Sub-sale or pledge of the goods by the buyer will not affect this right unless and until even the seller has consented for such sub-sale or pledge. So it's pretty logical. If the seller has consented for a sub-sale or pledge, why would he exercise a right of stoppage in transit? So if the seller has exercised the right of stoppage in transit, it is irrelevant whether the buyer has made a sub-sale or whether he's pledged such goods to another party. The possession of the goods still lies with the seller. He exercises the right of stoppage in transit, and if possibly later on he could exercise the right of resell as well. So these were the important points, my dear friends, totally about 12 points. You may verbatim repeat the same points in the exam. Definitely with a little bit of examples you will be able to enjoy the best possible marks as far as the examination is concerned. Yes, we come to the last limb of the chapter on unpaid seller. Very quickly, not much to discuss about it, pretty straightforward. Let us see what are those. Right of an unpaid seller against the buyer. Right of an unpaid seller against the goods we have seen. Now we are going to see right of an unpaid seller against the buyer. What are the various rights? We can also refer this as remedies available to the unpaid seller against the buyer. First of the right or suit for price. Suit for price means, I have already told you, owner of the goods is the buyer because property is already transferred. Only the possession is with the seller, so therefore by chance if the possession is also lost, if the possession of the goods from the seller is lost to the buyer, then the only remedy that the seller has against the buyer for his price is file a suit of recovery of price. Now it is interesting to note that if by chance the price had to be paid on a specified date and that date has been missed, it is irrelevant whether ownership is transferred, it is irrelevant whether the goods have been delivered or not. What do I mean by this? If delivery of goods has already taken place, then you can file a case for recovery of the price. That is the first point. Second point, if by chance in the contract the price had to be paid on a specified date and if that date has expired, it is immaterial whether the ownership is transferred or whether the goods is transferred. Definitely the complete price can be recovered, including the damages. Interesting to note, the price can be recovered even though the goods ownership has not been transferred. That's the beauty of suit for price. Let's see the second case wherein or the second right of an unpaid seller against the buyer, that is suit for damages for non-acceptance. In Contract Act, we have already discussed about what is meant by damages. We have ordinary damages, special damages, punitive damages, and so on and so forth. That is, various types of damages can be filed as a matter of fact, as a matter of right against the unpaid, against the buyer by the unpaid seller. What are the various damages? Ordinary damages means the direct loss which is incurred because the non-acceptance has taken place, which has resulted into the loss to the seller. There is a special damage, probably. What do you mean by special damage? If the contract is already stated that in case of non-acceptance by either of the parties, the party at fault has to pay so and so or so much of the amount or so and so rate of interest to the party not at fault, then that becomes a special damages case. So suit for damages for non-acceptance. Third, repudiation of the contract before due date. Repudiation, as we all know by now, that it is nothing but cancellation of a contract. In case the contract has to be cancelled before the due date. What do you mean by before the due date? Again, we go back to Contract Act. We can see cancellation of the contract on a particular date or before the due date, wherein that is called breach and anticipatory breach. On the particular date, if you are cancelling the contract, then it is called breach. The party has breached the contract and you are taking action against it. Where the party has already breached, but the time is yet to arrive. The contract time is yet to arrive. The time is not yet elapsed. The time is not yet expired. Then you can convert the breach as anticipatory breach and still claim damages or suit for price and recover whatever benefits that you are entitled for. What do I mean by this? Repudiate means cancel the contract before the due date, where the due date is yet to expire. If the other party has breached, you have two options. One, wait for the due date and then cancel the contract or claim the damages and file a suit for recovery of the price. Or two, today itself you can treat that breach as though it is an anticipatory breach and cancel the contract and file a case for suit for price and also damages. I hope the point on anticipatory breach was clear. That means you want to cancel before the due date. You are anticipating that he will not perform the contract and hence you are going for this suit. Next, suit for interest, pretty straightforward. Well, if it is already mentioned in the contract that if there is a delay in payment, so and so rate of interest has to be paid, so be it. However, if nothing is mentioned in the contract, then there are two possibilities. One, the buyer is being informed from the seller that, by way of a notice of course, that the seller will be charging a rate of interest from so and so date. Then from so and so date, the interest becomes chargeable. Now, why is this interest becoming chargeable? It is because of the default of the buyer. It is because of the error of the buyer. It is because of the breach of the buyer. This interest is becoming leviable. Now, the second, wherein what if the matter has gone to the court? Can the court award interest? Yes, definitely. Courts may probably think about two possible scenarios as to when to apply the rate of interest or from which date to apply the rate of interest. Scenario number one, when did the seller tender the delivery? From that date. Or when was the buyer liable to pay the price? From that date. Depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, the court may take the Honorable Court may take any of these two mechanisms. That is, when did the seller tender the delivery? When did the seller attempt to give the delivery to the buyer? From that date, the interest may become chargeable. Or if the courts decide, if the Honorable Courts decide that when was the buyer liable to pay, which date the buyer was liable to pay, the courts may decide on that scenario as well, that buyer was liable to pay from so and so date. He is not yet paid from so and so date till date, so interest may become chargeable from so and so date. So that was, my dear friends, the rights of an unpaid seller against the buyer. The rights of an unpaid seller against the goods was right of lien, right of stoppage in transit, and right of resale. Here we have four rights against the buyer, that is suit for price, suit for damages for non-acceptance, repudiation of the contract before the due date, and suit for interest. Of course, yes, we have another interesting topic to cover, that is remedies of buyer against the seller. What if the mistake was at the seller's end? What if the breach was at the seller's end and the buyer is very clear and he's performed his share of contract? Then we see what are the different rights. Remedies of buyer against the seller can also be read as rights of the buyer against the seller. Let's see what it is. 1. Damages for non-delivery. Again, if the seller has not delivered willfully or he's refused to deliver, please note, buyer has already paid the price here. or he is willing to pay the price, should I say. If the seller, by willful default of his, rejected to deliver, refused to deliver, or forcefully not delivered, then whatever loss the buyer has incurred due to this non-delivery, then a related loss can be claimed as damages by way of a suit. I hope you got it. Next, suit for specific performance. Here, specific performance means a big, very big, large aspect of the legal world. How do I establish this? I'll give you a small example. Let's say I have identified a painter who does beautiful artwork. Let's say, just to take an example, Mr. A beautifully sketches the total picture or a total physique of a particular model, a celebrity. So I loved the fact that the particular person, that is the painter, the artist, Mr. A, has beautifully sketched, painted various artists or various celebrities. I rely upon his expertise. I want him only and nobody else to paint a celebrity's photo. In such a scenario, let's say Mr. A has entered into a contract with this artist to paint a particular model or a photo of a particular celebrity, and is agreeing to pay, or is already paid, or is tendering to pay the money. Having said that, once the money, or rather the contract has started, let's say half the painting or half the sketching has been done. Now, if Mr. Artist says, no more I can paint, I will ask my substitute or I'll ask my assistant to paint, then Mr. A can go to the court of law and ask for specific performance. That means the artist only has to paint and no one else has to paint. That is the meaning of specific performance. In simple words, where a contract has been awarded or contract has been entered into between both the parties based on the skills and the knowledge and the talent of a particular person, only such person can execute, or the court makes only such person to execute in case of breach by such person. Here the court can award Mr. A that artist only has to paint and not his assistant. That is the meaning of specific performance. So if there is a need, the buyer can go against the seller by putting a case or filing a case for suit for specific performance and asking only the seller to deliver the goods and no one else. That is the meaning of suit for specific performance. I hope you got the point. Indian Penal Code, Code of Civil Procedure, Code of Criminal Procedure, all this, when you go and read it, you will see specific performance as one of the remedies if there is a contract which involves skills and talents in it. Next, suit for breach of warranty. We have already seen this in conditions and warranties, wherein if there is a secondary or a collateral part of the transaction which is not performed, then it is amounting to breach of warranty, then you can file a suit for damages for breach of warranty. Of course, there was another point where if voluntarily a breach of condition was treated as breach of warranty, then a suit for damages also lies in the same. A breach of warranty leads to damages. That right is also available for the buyer against the seller. Next, suit for interest, which we have already covered in the previous case. Repudiation of the contract before the due date is also the same, which I have already covered in the previous case, that is rights of an unpaid seller against the buyer. So we have basically 5 rights, that is damages for non-delivery, suit for specific performance, suit for breach of warranty, suit for interest, and repudiation of the contract before the due date. These were the rights of an unpaid seller against the buyer and rights or remedies of the buyer against the seller respectively under contract, or rather under Sale of Goods Act 1930. So friends, this was about it. We have another two small issues which we will discuss in a short while and then conclude this chapter. Let me take a small 10 seconds break. I have some water, please. Thank you. Yes, welcome back. Now, what is called an auction sale? Well, it is also part of Sale of Goods Act. Why? It is no doubt a sale which involves probably movable goods. What is it all about? Auction sale means it is a mode of selling a property. Property here I mean movable goods, by inviting bids from public and sold to the highest bidder. So what happens? Let's say an antique piece which is movable in nature is available for an auction. There's a person called auctioneer who will be explaining the characteristic features of that particular antique piece, and there are people who are sitting in the lot who are called bidders, who are basically members of the public. Anybody who bids the highest, that person to such person this product or this antique piece will be sold. This is the basic meaning of auctioning. Of course, we have a lot of other things to be considered that we will see it at a later point of time. As of now, for Sale of Goods Act, this much is sufficient. What is it all about? Basically, the auctioneer will be an agent of the seller. The seller who is intending to sell his product can keep it for auction. The auctioneer is a person who invites bids from various members of the public, and whichever member of the public has bid the highest amount, he sells this product to the highest bidder, collects the money, takes his fees, his nominal charges, whatever it is, and remits this balance money to the seller. Basically, the auctioneer works as a agent of the seller. So what are the points to be considered? Keep it in mind. This can come as a short note question for an exam, so pretty important. Do not underestimate it. First one, rules of an auction sale. 1. When the goods are sold in lots. When the goods are sold in lots, each lot will be treated as a separate contract of sale. You can't treat the whole lot as one single contract. Let's say there are 100 units and there were 10 lots. In that way, 10 cases of bidding, then each lot will be treated as a separate lot and a separate contract has to be executed. In this example, there will be 10 different contracts of sale. Next, completion of the contract of sale. When does the contract of sale happens or ends? I'm sure you would have watched IPL bidding. There's a person who is announcing the cricket players' names, and there are teams sitting in the auditorium or wherever the auction is taking place, where the price is finalized, the highest bidder's price is finalized. The auctioneer says 1, 2, 3 gone. So 1, 2, 3 gone. When that happens, then only their sale is concluded. Why do I say this? Let's say one of the teams had made a highest bid for one of the players. Highest bid 1, 2, and there comes the person from the other team who bids a higher price, or if the existing team which has already bid the higher price says I retract, that means I take back my highest bid, then the contract is not yet concluded. The auctioning process still continues. So 1, 2, 3 gone, only then the auction is completed. Therefore, we see the involvement of customary practices over here. In some places, there need not be a hammer hit of 3, there could be only one hammer hit, and then the contract is concluded. So, when is the completion of the contract? I told you, on the hit of the hammer or any customary practices, the contract is concluded. Before the hit of the hammer, the highest bidder can retract or can take back his bid, the contract is not concluded, the process of bidding or the process of auctioning still continues. I hope you got the point. Next, a right to bid may be reserved. What do you mean by this? If the members of the public feel we should not allow the seller himself to bid, or we can say only a certain members of the public are allowed to bid, then we have a topic called right to bid may be reserved. The reservation can be given only to a certain segment of people and not all of them. Example, let's say a unique diamond, a Kohinoor diamond was up for auction, then only persons who are having net worth above 100 crores are allowed to bid. If this is the condition, then we have reserved the right to bid for only people having net worth of above 100 crores. It straight away states if you are having 99.99 crores of net worth, then you cannot participate in the bid. I hope the example was clear enough to understand what is meant by right to bid may be reserved. Next, we go on to understand where the sale is not notified by the seller. That means if among the bidders, the seller should not participate. If that is the condition, then seller is denied to participate in the bid simply because of the fact that if seller is also one of the members of the bidders, he with malified intention may increase the bid, and eventually if by chance he itself becomes the final highest bidder, the contract is null and void because he cannot sell his own goods to himself. Therefore, there could be a clear bar on the seller to become one of the bidders. Am I clear about what this point says? Where the sale is not notified by the seller. Next, reserve price. Reserve price, again an IPL example. Each player, each and every player can have a base price. Anybody who wants to bid can bid only above that and not below that. This base price is called reserve price. Next point, pretended bidding. What is that? Yes, there are members of public sitting as bidders and bidding. There might be a person who is appointed by the seller. Please understand this point, that is fourth point, said seller is barred from bidding. This cannot be a general case. If the members of the public are open to it, there is no problem. But if the bidders are open to it, there is no problem. But if the bidders have put a special condition that the seller should not be one of the bidders, then fourth point is addressed over there. However, the sixth point, what we are trying to tell is, what the law is trying to tell is, if by chance the seller has appointed a person to bid only to increase the price, to pretend as a bidder, he has no intention whatsoever to buy. Whenever there is a bid, let's say 1 crore is one of the bids, then this pretended bidder says 1 crore 1 lakh. He has no intention to bid and take the product or purchase the product. He only tries to increase the price. In the process, it is a malified action of the pretended bidder only for the purpose of increasing the price. If and when it is proved, then such contracts can be a void contract. So this was all about auction. This can be an expected short notes question in your exam. Please be well prepared for it. Lastly, just 2 to 3 minutes I will take and close it. What is it? Whenever there is a transaction, whether it is a sale of goods by normal course or whether it is by way of an auction, we have a particular problem that once the sale is concluded, what is the amount of taxes to be added? So when the process of sale is happening or when the process of auction is happening, by chance there is an increase in the tax rate or decrease in the tax rate, then what happens is the issue that we are trying to discuss. Check the first point. Always mention it as price plus taxes. Whenever you are entering into a transaction, mention the product's price and also mention plus applicable taxes to safeguard the position. If you do so, then if the taxes increases, the buyer has to pay more. If the taxes decreases, the buyer has to pay less. You are safeguarded with your price. Of course, however, we also have to say that there can be an agreement to the contrary and it can be entered into between the parties. That means whatever is the taxes, this is the final price. We call this as fixed price transactions if you have observed in many of the sales. So, if the price plus taxes is mentioned, any increase in taxes, buyer ends up paying more. If there is a decrease in taxes, buyer ends up paying less. But if there is an agreement to the contrary, so be it. There will be a fixed price regardless of the taxes. That means whatever the increase or decrease of taxes do not impact the buyer. Buyer is free to pay a particular price. Examples of taxes is customs duty. Whenever there is an import and export, we have to pay a duty. That duty is called customs duty. GST, as all you guys know, goods and services tax, and VAT, that is value added tax, and so on and so forth, and other forms of indirect taxes can play its role on increase or decrease of taxes related to the final price that the buyer has to pay. So friends, we come to the end of Sale of Goods Act 1930. I hope this journey was quite successful. I hope that you're viewing the videos again and again to the best of your abilities. In case you have any doubts, clarifications, I'm always there. Please mail it to lohitacademy@gmail.com. As quickly as possible, I will revert back. Thank you very much for your kind support in watching these videos. Please do revise more for your exams. Definitely, it's an important chapter. Do not miss any part of this chapter. See you. I will get back to you more on these things as soon as possible. Thank you very much.